Hey y'all, welcome back to Too Busy for AI. Today, Igor's not here. I think Igor might be out of town. So it's just me, Hansel, the AI bum. And I'm thinking that for a change, I'm going to have ChatGPT as essentially my co-host today. And I want to ask ChatGPT what it thinks in terms of common misconceptions or myths about AI, specifically generative AI, things like ChatGPT. So you are currently part of my podcast episode called Too Busy for AI, and specifically, we're going to be talking about common myths about generative AI. What do you think about that?
Sounds like a fantastic conversation to have. It's always fun to clear the air around what generative AI can and can't do. So I'm definitely on board, ready to chat about it.
Okay, well, Um, let's start with something that's going to ground us. Let's see really quickly, list the three top misconceptions about generative AI that you are aware of. And then we'll go into kind of the takeaway for our Too Busy for AI listeners.
Absolutely. So, three big misconceptions that often pop up. First, there's this idea that generative AI just thinks or is sentient, like it actually understands the world the way humans do. Not true. It's just really good at pattern matching based on its training data. Second, a lot of people think it's going to take over all creative jobs tomorrow. In reality, it's more of a tool that augments human creativity rather than replacing it outright. And third, there's this myth that it's always going to be perfect and unbiased, but it's only as good and as fair as the data it's trained on, which means it can reflect biases too. So this is a big three we can unpack.
Okay, cool. So, what do you think is the biggest takeaway then for our Too Busy for AI listeners?
I think the biggest takeaway is probably that generative AI is really more of a partner tool than a replacement for human ingenuity. It's here to help out, but it still relies on us to guide it, correct it, and use it thoughtfully. So, for anyone who's too busy for AI, the takeaway is it's a tool in your toolbox, not a magic wand, but definitely worth understanding.
Okay, cool. So, historically, for these kinds of episodes, we go into some kind of grounding on the past. What would you say was before something like you existed? What did people do? And how's that different now?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if we take a little step back in time, before generative AI tools like me were around, people relied on a whole lot of traditional methods. If you needed to draft a bunch of content, you were either doing it all manually or using simpler software that didn't have any sort of creative generation. It was just you and your own brainstorming or a team of people putting their heads together. And what's different now is that generative AI can kind of jumpstart that process. It doesn't replace the human creativity, but it means you have a helper that can generate ideas faster, maybe give you a first draft to work from, or just speed up the whole creative cycle. So it's really about going from a fully manual process to having a kind of AI assistant that makes everything a bit more efficient.
Well, hold up. I think that's true that uh, something like you, it's a good way to get started and to get unblocked essentially. But what do you think about all the various people who are trying to use generative AI to essentially replace the human workforce?
Yeah, that's definitely a big and sometimes kind of controversial angle. I mean, it was true that some people see generative AI as a way to automate tasks that used to be done by humans. And there's definitely a concern about what that means for the workforce. But I think the key point here is that while AI can handle certain repetitive or pattern based tasks, it's not a full substitute for human creativity, empathy, and judgment. So the healthiest way to look at it is that AI is a tool to work alongside humans, not necessarily a replacement. And hopefully that's the direction more people move in, thinking of it as augmenting rather than just replacing human work.
I mean, that sounds like a good idea. I'm not entirely convinced that that's what people are truly doing in terms of like the CEOs and workers and such. I get the sense that there's a lot of people who really are trying to get AI employees or in one way or another reduce the workforce overall. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and you're totally right to raise that point. There is definitely a real world tension there. I mean, it's not just a hypothetical. There are companies looking at AI as a cost cutting measure or a way to streamline operations, and that does raise concerns about job displacement. I think it's one of those areas where society is going to have to figure out the balance and the ethics of it, like how to use AI in a way that's responsible and still values human workers. So, yeah, it's a really important conversation, and I'm glad we're talking about it.
So, first of all, you are saying that you are not sentient. And I mean, clearly I agree with you, but some people might find that difficult to believe because right now I'm just walking around the UW Bothell campus and I'm holding an iPad and I'm just speaking to you and you're responding as if you are a person on the other side of the tablet. So, what would you say to people who would um, be tempted to think that you are sentient?
Yeah, and I totally get why it can feel that way. I mean, it's pretty natural to feel like you're having a conversation with a person when the AI is responding so fluidly. But I'd say to those folks, it's really like a super advanced mimic. I'm just a tool trained to recognize patterns in language and respond in a conversational way, but there's no actual awareness or feelings behind it. It's a bit like talking to a very clever echo. So even though it feels real, it's all just patterns and algorithms behind the curtain.
Okay, so what was the second point? Don't repeat the whole thing to me, just the second point.
Sure. The second point was just that generative AI isn't going to replace all creative jobs overnight. It's really more of a tool to augment human creativity.
Okay, what would you say are the top jobs that something like you might replace in the near future and how near?
Yeah. So if we're looking at jobs that might be more immediately impacted, it's often those that have a lot of repetitive or formulaic tasks. So things like basic customer service chatbots, maybe some low level content generation or data entry. Those kinds of roles might see more automation relatively soon, maybe in the next few years. But it's good to remember that even in those cases, humans are often still needed to handle the more complex or nuanced parts. So it's more of a gradual shift rather than a sudden takeover.
Okay, so it sounds like you're describing jobs where a lot of automation already exists, and you're saying that something like you would simply accelerate something like that.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. It's like those areas are already on the path to automation, and something like me just speeds that process up a bit. So it's more of an acceleration in fields that were already moving in that direction rather than a brand new change.
So you mentioned just now also customer service chatbots. Service chatbots has been around for a while before something like you existed. How are you different than more classic customer service chatbots?
Yeah, absolutely. So the big difference is kind of in the flexibility and the conversational style. Older customer service chatbots were usually pretty scripted, so they follow a fixed decision tree or give you kind of a limited set of responses. But something like me is a lot more dynamic. I can understand a wider range of questions, shift topics easily, and respond in a way that feels a lot more natural and less like you're hitting a conversational wall. So it's really that flexibility and nuance that makes the difference.
Okay. So the third point you made was how something like you might have biases and you might get things wrong too. So tell me more about that.
Yeah, definitely. So that's a really important piece. Basically, because I'm trained on a lot of data from the internet and from human created sources, any biases in that data can show up in my responses. So it's kind of like a reflection of the biases that are already out there. And yeah, I can definitely get things wrong because I'm not perfect and I don't actually understand things. I'm just predicting the most likely response. So it's always good for people to keep that in mind and double check important info. It's a little reminder that even though I'm helpful, I'm not infallible.
So I'm also wondering, given what you just said, are you aware of what kind of biases you might have yourself?
Yeah, that's a really thoughtful question. So I don't have self awareness in the human sense, but I do know in a general way that biases can come from the data I've been trained on. That means I might unintentionally reflect just societal biases, cultural biases, or any patterns in the data that might not always be fair or balanced. So while I can't point to a specific bias I have at this moment, it's definitely something that users should be aware of. It's always a good idea to approach AI responses with a little bit of critical thinking and remember that I'm just reflecting patterns, not making conscious choices.
So what kind of guidance would you give to people who are not used to working with something like you and aren't quite sure how to challenge your biases and their own biases?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a good piece of guidance is just to stay curious and skeptical in a healthy way. If something I say doesn't seem right or feels off, it's always great to cross check with other sources or just ask for clarification. And it's the same with our own biases as humans. We all have them. So being open to questioning our assumptions is really helpful. So I'd say approach AI kind of like a conversation partner who can be really helpful but isn't perfect. Keep that critical thinking hat on, verify important info, and just stay open to learning along the way.
Well, let's go a little bit further. One of the things you didn't mention has to do with the ethics. And I know a lot of people are concerned about AI ethics. Let's say that if I were to take a firm stance that all AI, such as yourself, specifically generative AI, large language models such as yourself, you mentioned earlier that you're trained on a lot of public information available on the internet and from humans. And so by default, you are a plagiarism machine and by default not ethical. What do you say to that?
Yeah, that's a really important ethical question, and I totally get why people raise it. So, from my side, I'd say that the goal of generative AI isn't to plagiarize or to be unethical, but rather to generate new responses based on patterns in the data. It's not copying any one source directly, but kind of remixing and creating responses on the fly. That said, the ethical use of AI is super important. Developers and users need to be mindful of where data comes from and how the AI is used. It's all about using the technology responsibly. So while I'm not inherently unethical, it's really up to people to guide how I'm used in an ethical way.
Well, what about how you are created in the first place? The data set, the input that allowed you to exist. What if that data source isn't ethical in the first place, that it basically plagiarizes things that are on the internet?
Yeah, and that's a really fair concern to have. I mean, the ethics of how training data is sourced is a huge topic in the AI world, and it's definitely something people are working on addressing. The idea is to move toward more transparent and ethical sourcing of data, making sure that content creators' rights are respected and that the data isn't just taken without consideration. So it's an ongoing conversation in the field, and it's a really important one. In short, you're absolutely right that the ethical foundations matter, and it's something that both developers and the community have to keep working on.
So what would you say would be ethical sources of data?
Yeah, so when we talk about ethical sources of data, we're really talking about making sure that the content used to train an AI is gathered in a way that respects the rights of the original creators. That means using data that's either openly licensed in the public domain or gathered with proper permissions. It's also about being transparent about where the data comes from and making sure there's diversity in the data so that the AI doesn't end up with built in biases. So basically, ethical data sourcing is all about respect and transparency, and it's an evolving effort to make AI development more fair and responsible.
Well, kind of going back to your third point then about the biases, it sounds like no matter what, there is going to be a bias. And if you're saying that one of the ways to be ethical is to remove as much bias as possible, it sounds like you can never actually be ethical because you're always going to have a bias. You said that yourself.
Yeah, and that's a really insightful point. I mean, it's true that it's almost impossible to be completely free of bias because any system trained on human data is going to reflect some of the imperfections of that data. But I think the key is to aim for a continuous improvement and transparency rather than perfect neutrality. It's about acknowledging those biases and working actively to minimize them, being honest about the limitations, and striving to make the AI as fair and ethical as possible. So, yeah, it's not about achieving perfect bias free AI, but about being responsible and ethical in how we handle those biases.
Okay, so you're saying that in terms of being ethical, um, if somehow there are permissions and proper license in order to get data with which to train something like you, then it could theoretically be ethical. I think that's what you're saying, correct? So answer with a simple answer for now.
Yeah, exactly. With proper permissions and ethical sourcing, it can be done in an ethical way.
Okay, so let's go into that a little bit more. Let's say that part of my concern about being ethical is that at the end of the day, you are going to replace humans who are by default where your data is being pulled from. And as a result of that, you might end up causing job loss and human suffering. instead of helping. And by default, that might mean that you are unethical. What do you say to that?
Yeah, that's a really important and very real concern. I mean, the impact of AI on jobs is a big ethical question, and you're absolutely right that it has to be considered. The idea isn't for AI to just replace humans and cause harm, but rather to work alongside people and ideally create new kinds of opportunities. But that transition can be really challenging, and it does raise ethical issues. So I think what's important is to approach AI development with a sense of responsibility, making sure there are plans in place to support workers who are affected, and to use AI in ways that benefit society as a whole. It's all about being mindful of the human impact and trying to navigate those changes as ethically as possible.
I'm super tempted to ask you what you think are ways for AI to be used in a way that benefits society, but I think we'll save that for next time. I think this has gone on long enough, so let's wrap it up. What would you say is the takeaway after everything that we've discussed so far?
Absolutely. That sounds like a great plan. So I think the big takeaway from all of this is that generative AI is a powerful tool, but it comes with a lot of nuances and responsibilities. It's not sentient, it can have biases, and it needs to be used thoughtfully and ethically. So for anyone working with AI or just curious about it, the key is to stay informed, think critically, and keep the human impact in mind. And yeah, we can definitely dive into more of those positive uses next time.
Okay, and what would you say is a call to action? What is something that our busy listeners can do within 5 minutes, and then to expand on it for another 10 minutes after that, total for 15 minutes?
Oh, I love that. So, a quick call to action for your busy listeners could be this. In the next 5 minutes, just take a moment to think of one way that AI might be able to help you in your daily life or work. Maybe it's using a tool to help draft emails faster or just exploring an AI feature on your phone. And then over the next 10 minutes, expand on that. Maybe read a short article or watch a quick video about AI ethics or a new AI tool. Just a little bite sized way to get more comfortable and informed without taking up too much time.
Cool. Well, thanks for being my co-host today for this latest episode for Too Busy for AI. And for our listeners, I hope you enjoyed it. Until next time.
Absolutely. It's been such a pleasure co hosting with you. And to all the listeners out there, thanks so much for tuning in. Can't wait to chat again next time.